What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my 10 most anticipated upcoming games. With all of the recent showcases and game announcements, I thought it would be a fun time to sit down and talk about the games that I personally am the most excited for. Be a bit objective to a fault, and people don't exactly get an impression of whether or not I actually enjoyed a title, especially since I'm not the type to get particularly animated. But in the case of these games, they are games that I am very much so excited for and looking forward to playing. So with that out of the way, I figured we would start with the most obvious ones. First up, we have Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, the first CRPG set in the Warhammer 40k universe, made by Owlcat Games, who have also made a few CRPGs in the Pathfinder universe, which I'm a big fan of, and seeing as much of this channel is dedicated to CRPGs and RPGs in general, not much of a surprise that I would be looking forward to this one, especially with how much I covered Wrath of the Righteous. But for my regular viewers, that is exceedingly obvious, as I've already been covering its beta and alpha pretty extensively, and all we're really waiting on here is a proper release date. And while overall the systems will likely be much simpler than Pathfinder's, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. And given that this game inspired me to look into all of the Warhammer 40k universe, as I didn't know much about it when the game was first announced, it's been a pretty fun time for me, and I'm looking forward to playing the full version. The next very obvious one is Baldur's Gate 3. Back when I was a much smaller channel with under 1,000 subs even, one of the things I really enjoyed covering was the Divinity universe. After playing Divinity Original Sin 2, I had to know everything about it, which led me to playing all of the games by Larian Studios, and even just within the Divinity franchise, the genres are wide and varied. So given my love for that developer's games as well as the Baldur's Gate and D&D franchise, it makes sense that I would be very excited for Baldur's Gate 3, especially seeing how the budget for this game seems to have been immense. And we finally have our release date of August 31st after a very long early access period. But even within that early access period, there's been immense changes to the game, refinements, and while I'm not personally wild about D&D 5e, Baldur's Gate 3 is shaping up to be a very incredible game just by the early access period alone, and given that we're not exactly getting a ton of CRPGs these days, it being another CRPG is another thing I'm very much so excited for, and for me personally, arguably the biggest release of this year. Though I imagine trying to do everything for the review on this one is going to be a bit painful. Next up, however, we have Avowed, the upcoming RPG experience from Obsidian set in the Pillars of Eternity universe, slated to release in 2024. The Pillars of Eternity franchise was a set of isometric CRPGs as well, however, Avowed is going to be first person. And while I personally simply would have preferred a Pillars of Eternity 3, I am still pretty happy to take anything in that universe, especially if it expands and grows the lore in any particular way, as Avowed looks to take us to an area of that world known as the Living Lands that will provide an opportunity to both expand the lore as well as give us simply a new story with the setting of that world. What I'm most curious about here is how they're going to handle implementing all of the mechanics and everything from the Pillars franchise into this new genre, or if at all even. But either way, I love that franchise and the setting, so I'm very excited to see what they wind up doing with that, as Obsidian is known for making some of my favorite titles. Next up, however, something a little more vague with Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. I love Vampire the Masquerade in general. Bloodlines was an amazing RPG, even if it's a very old cult classic at this point. And that's to say nothing of the very tumultuous development cycle of Bloodlines 2, which was originally supposed to have been released quite some time ago, before being shifted to a new unnamed developer and going silent for quite some time. However, very recently, they announced that they would finally be sharing some information on that in September. I do want to mention with this one that I think any grounded response to this is to be very skeptical of what they've got going on, simply because of the very, I would say, almost dire situation around the development of this game. So I admit some of my excitement here is a little bit of morbid curiosity to see if they can pull this off or if it's going to be a disaster. because I'm along for the ride either way. I sincerely hope it's great. I think the vampire franchise could really use a win right now, especially after they have only had some recent, more middling titles, to be honest, and then the closure of that Battle Royale game means that I think there's a lot riding on Bloodlines 2, and if it's a disaster, I think it's going to be really bad. But I very much so want to know how this one pans out, which we won't have to wait too much longer for some information on at the least, but hard to say much more beyond that. Next up, though, we have Shadow Gambit, a stealth strategy indie title that is due out in October from Me Games, the people behind Desperados 3, and while a little bit different from the stuff I normally cover, there's a certain amount of tactical element to it because I cover a lot of tactical RPGs as well, and combined with the relatively fast-paced nature, if you want them to be, of the sort of real-time with pause system that sees us systematically taking out enemies and playing with abilities in a relatively low-stakes game that encourages save scumming, leads me to believe, from having played it a little bit personally already ahead of the demo launch next week as part of Steam's Next Fest, that this game is probably going to serve as a fun palate cleanser for me that gives me an opportunity to shake up exactly what I'm doing and the types of games I'm playing while still feeling a bit familiar. So most of my excitement for this one is simply to play something a little bit different while also a little more just focused on the fun, because sometimes it's easier to jump into a shorter experience than it is a sweeping RPG that I'm doing for a review. And in a somewhat similar vein, we then have the Lamplighter's League from Harebrained Schemes, which are the people behind the Shadowrun trilogy. This game is out October 3rd, and will see us taking part in an alternative 1930s history where a shadowy cult is taking over the world, and we have to band together a group of misfits to sort of stop them from carrying out their almost Cthulhu-esque occult aims. Now, in many ways, this game appears to simply be a TRPG. However, given that it's from Harebrained Schemes, who has a lot of experience with this style of gameplay, has me pretty excited to play it. Though, I will say, as TRPGs go, this looks like a pretty standard one in many respects, at least mechanically speaking, with a few twists here and there as most of them manage to pull off. But seeing as TRPGs are a favorite genre of mine, no surprise here that I'm looking forward to this one as well. Again, one of the smaller indie titles that I think is simply going to be fun to play and not probably eat up a ton of time. Fourth to last, though, we have Banishers, Ghosts of New Eden, a game that is due out in 2023 sometime, being developed by Don't Nod Entertainment, the people behind Vampire, but this game is set in 1695, and we will be taking on the role of two lovers, one of which is dead, as they hunt ghosts, as they attempt to protect the living from the threat of lingering ghosts and specters. One thing I've really enjoyed about this game is some of the preview trailers and the just general aesthetics and everything that they've been going for, but from their Steam page, it seems much of the story will resolve around your lover and partner's status as a ghost. As you are a ghost hunter, her being a ghost isn't exactly great for anyone, and it looks like you're trying to do something to help her move on, basically. Either way, though, I really enjoy the vibes this game gives off, and I'm looking forward to checking it out. Third up, we have definitely them. And as such, I'm really looking forward to this game. Second to last, we have South of Midnight, another recently announced title that will see us taking on the role of Hazel, and a supernatural imagining of the American South. This one is made by the creators of We Happy Few, Compulsion Games, and this one promises to be a third-person action adventure that sees us confronting and subduing all sorts of supernatural creatures, while also trying to find out about our own past. Now, what speaks to me about this game is largely its setting. As some people know, I actually live in the American South, and honestly, just any game set in the general vicinity of where I actually live or have lived is innately interesting to me. As an example, I bought Far Cry 5 because it was set in Montana, where I lived for a year, despite not really being into the Far Cry series. That, combined with the tone of the supernatural that they showed off in their trailer, has me very interested in this one, and while I don't have a release date or anything, so it might be a while, I'm definitely keeping an eye on this one and seeing how it shapes up. Last but not least, though, that open universe, I guess, action RPGs, but what has me most excited about this is that they seem to be building more on the RPG systems this time around, especially things that we haven't really seen them do since, like, Oblivion, which just so happens to remain my personal minutes you'll be able to visit and explore is actually good, or how that content is curated, etc. I think after watching their 45-minute deep dive into all of the various systems you can play with and how much attention to detail there is there's a lot to be excited for about Starfield. And I think worst case scenario, like many of other Bethesda's games, it might just be made even more interesting by the modders who are very likely to get a hold of it, as thankfully Bethesda likes to support that community with tools at the very least. Though on a more personal note, with it launching less than a week after Baldur's Gate 3 does, means that particular week is going to be very painful for me, I imagine, as I try to move through all these games and get them reviewed and checked out, as September in particular is shaping up to be an incredibly busy month for releases. That said, that's everything I've got for you guys today. That has been my 10 most anticipated titles, some of which we'll see relatively soon, some of which we're not really sure about, but either way, obviously I'm following them, I plan on reviewing them, and with any luck, they'll actually be pretty great as well. That said, that is everything I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.